It's always good to be back here on a Friday for the Morning Pitt Mailbag here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We're all excited because the Wizards got a win last night over the Kings. Big Wizards fans over here. Wizards improved their record in the Summer League to 2-2. Shout out to Washington. Shout out to the Wizards for getting a win. Bub Carrington, a pretty sweet move at the end to almost give the Wizards the go-ahead basket, but he got blocked after breaking dude's ankles. So anyway, we will have our regular periodic updates on the Washington Wizards for at least a little while until we get distracted by other things. But for now, we got our Morning Pitt Mailbag where we're taking your questions about Pitt football, Pitt basketball, Pitt recruiting, everything else going on in the world of Pitt sports. It's what we do every Friday here on the Morning Pitt. Well, we asked for the questions on Tuesday or Wednesday. You guys post the questions throughout the week, and then we answer all of them right here on the Friday edition of the Morning Pitt. So we got a lot of great questions from the Pitt fans at Panther-Lair.com. Let's jump into it. The Morning Pitt Mailbag right here, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, it's always fun to do these mailbags. I say it every week. It probably sounds cliched at this point, but I say it every week, and I really do believe it. I mean, it's fun to do these Morning Pitt mailbags. You guys come up with great questions every week. I always look forward to it, and we have great questions here once again. You know what we always ask you to do, of course, like this video and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. That way you never miss any of our Pitt video content, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, and the website Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com for the most comprehensive source of Pitt sports news on the internet. Football, basketball, recruiting, it's all at Panther-Lair.com, and message boards to interact with hundreds and thousands of other Pitt fans all day, every day. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Let's jump into our questions. Of course, first one, as always, comes from Smenges, one of our regular mailbag participants, and we appreciate it very much. It says, what would it honestly take to elevate Pitt recruiting to the top 15 level of a Penn State, which has minimal local and only decent in-state talent pool to pull from? What would it take to get into that top 15 level consistently for Pitt? And my first response is it's just not likely to happen. You know what I mean? I think that top 15 level of recruiting for the schools that are there consistently are pretty much the usual suspects. And very few schools outside the usual suspects are able to elevate into that territory. I apologize. We've got a little bit of background noise. We'll see if we can maybe address that if it gets too bad. But it's very difficult for those outlier schools or schools that are not in that very top tier, that top 10 or 15 of just programs in the sport. It's tough to not just get into that top 15 in recruiting, but to stay there. Like, you can have a year every now and then where you do get into that realm, where you do recruit at that level, where a Pitt gets there, or a Washington or a Michigan State, where you can recruit at that level and maybe have a little bit of that kind of recruiting success. Maybe you have a few good years and you build off it to get into that territory. But to stay there requires establishing yourself as one of those top programs. You establish yourself as one of those top programs by winning a lot, winning consistently, winning national championships, competing for national championships. Now, in this current era, becoming a consistent playoff team. And I think that's going to be very difficult for the vast majority of schools in the sport to do. If you look at 65 or whatever Power 5 programs, you've got 10 or 15 at the top, the blue bloods or the elite, whatever you want to call it. But for the other 50 to 55 schools, every now and then you get a spot. Every now and then there would be Michigan State making the playoffs, or Washington made the playoffs, or Cincinnati made the playoffs. But only every now and then. TCU, right? Only every now and then. And it doesn't happen consistently, and none of those schools made repeat appearances. The repeat appearances were made by Clemson, Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, the usual suspects, right? And if you're not one of those usual suspects, you're probably going to have a difficult time getting there because your program is not established to operate at that level consistently. Anybody, if they get the right confluence of events, can get themselves there. right? I know they've said about that Western Michigan game in 2021. Well, if Pitt, if they don't lose that game, they make the playoffs. Well, maybe. You know what I mean? And maybe you could say that about the Miami game too, that if they just only lose one of those 2 games that year, they make the playoffs. And I know it's been said that, well, if they didn't lose the Western Michigan game, that Western Michigan game was a kick in the butt. It got them to sort of rally the troops, and they don't go on and win as much as they did that year if they didn't have that sort of wake-up call early in the season. I think that's a little bit of that's not a great mentality to have if you ask me. But regardless, that's how close they were. You know what I mean? Everything sort of came together for Pitt that year, and with just 1 or 2 luckier bounces, or maybe a little bit of an adjustment here or there, they could have won the Miami game, or they could have won the Western Michigan game. And if they did, if they only lost one of those 2 games, in a 12-team playoff, they would be a virtual lock. Actually, as an ACC champion, they would have been a virtual lock, right? So that's how close they would have been. It's possible to get a spot in the playoff. It's possible to get a spot, a seat at the big table. But it's far more difficult to get there consistently, year after year, to be able to go in and make the playoffs and compete at that level. It's difficult. And I think if you can't compete at that level consistently and get yourself there, established there, then it's really hard to recruit at that level consistently. I think you have to be one of the best. You have to be one of the blue bloods, or have like a Lane Kiffin or somebody coaching you. So, I mean, maybe to answer your question of what would it take, honestly, for Pitt to get there, one, it could be hire Urban Meyer, and hope you get 7 years out of it. You probably will you probably be able to recruit consistently at that level, or win a lot. You know what I mean? And get yourself to the playoffs, be a regular playoff contender. And if you start winning at that level and playing at that level, then you can start recruiting at that level. But of course, there's the whole problem that the recruiting feeds the success, right? So that makes it really difficult to get there. It still has a really long answer. The short answer is, unless you hire one of the best coaches, or unless you start winning and competing with the best of the best, it's going to be pretty hard to make it to that level and recruit at that level consistently. Every now and then you could do it. Every now and then you might get a spot in the playoff. Every now and then you get a top 15 class. But doing it consistently is another story, and just doesn't seem all that plausible. All right, moving on. Next question is from Jay Lazinger. Says, do you think our defense is too complicated to play in the era of high turnover and transfer portal movement? I think of this more specifically towards the linebackers. So I don't know. That's an interesting question. I don't know, because it was sold to us as being a relatively simple defense. And I mean, coaches, I think words don't always mean the same thing to coaches that they mean to basically everyone else. And a coach might describe their defense as being simple or easy to learn. And I think when Pat Narduzzi and those guys would talk about it being simple in those early years, they were talking about it more that they felt like it was sort of adaptable to any situation. Whatever the other team did, this defense had an answer for it. Now, we learned in like the second year of Narduzzi's tenure that wasn't entirely true. That defense didn't adapt all that well to the sort of hyper-specific situations. Let's just call them generally when other teams pass. It didn't exactly adapt all that well to those situations. It did really well when teams ran the ball, but when a team dropped back and attempted to pass, more often than not, they were fairly successful. But I think that's what they meant when they would say it was too easy. I don't think I understand where you're coming from. Like, if you're bringing players in 1 year and expecting them to succeed right away, counting on them to succeed right away, you need a system that's got to sort of lend itself to that. And does Pitt's system lend itself to that? I don't know if it does any more or less than any other defensive system. But it's an interesting question, though, and it's something I'd be interested to ask Pat Narduzzi and Randy Bates. Like, look, as you brought in transfers, you brought in Donovan McMillan last year. You're bringing in Key Thompson this year. You bring in the defensive linemen. Do you have to adjust the complexity of your defense when you're bringing in a guy and you're, as a transfer, you're expecting him to play right now. You're expecting Nate Matlack to play right now. You're expecting Nick James to play right now. You're expecting Key Thompson to play. You were expecting last year, you were expecting Donovan McMillan to play right now. Do you have to adjust the complexity of the defense in order to make it easier for those guys to acclimate themselves? And I'm guessing they would say no. I'm guessing they would say that they don't change it, that they expect those guys to do it. And the flip side, I guess, you're bringing in a veteran player and you're hoping that veteran player is maybe better prepared to adapt to a new scheme, to learn a new scheme, and to be able to, get it and be able to play it. But I don't know. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think it's something that if I remember, I'll ask Pat Narduzzi and Randy Bates. But I don't think, I don't think they'll change it all that much for that reason. And when you say, is it too complicated? I don't know, because, even though we talk about transfers and you talk about all the guys they brought in a lot of defensive linemen. They brought in Nate Matlack, David Ojebwe, Nick James, and Anthony Johnson, all along the defensive line. You look through the rest of the defense, you look through the back seven, Tamon Lynham might play and contribute at corner. I don't know if he'll start. Maybe he will. But, I mean, you're really, outside of Lynham and Key Thompson, you look at the back seven, the linebackers, corners, and safeties are all returning players. And almost all of them outside of Donovan McMillan are, homegrown guys, recruited guys. I mean, you look throughout all those linebackers we're talking about, Brandon George, Kyle Lewis, Jordan Bass, Braylon Lovelace, Rasheem Biles. You look at the corners, Rylan Gandy, Tamarian Crumpley, and Rashad Battle, and Noah Bigelow. You look at the safeties, Javon McIntyre, and P.J. O'Brien, and Cruz Brookins, and Jesse Anderson. I mean, all these guys are homegrown. So even if it's a tough defense to learn in 1 year, you're not relying on that many guys to come in and get it in their first year. You're relying on some, and you just have to hope it's going to work. You have to hope that they're going to succeed, like a Kylan Johnson did. Remember Kylan Johnson in 2019? He was a really good player. That was arguably Narduzzi's best defense, either that year or the next year. And Kylan Johnson was a really good player in that defense. He came in and got it in 1 year, playing linebacker like you're talking about. So it's not unheard of. It's not impossible to imagine. Donovan McMillan had 100 tackles last year playing in this defense for the first time. So no, I don't think it's too complicated. I think it can be learned. I think it can be taught. You got to make sure you have the right guys, all the while still maximizing what you can get out of your recruited guys and guys who have been in the system for a couple of years. Pitt Chag says, Chris, I know you said in the Morning Pit that you weren't sure about the details of the Capel extension, but do you foresee any continued basketball facilities upgrades in the works as part of this new agreement? Things can always get bigger. Things can always get nicer. Things can always get upgraded. Facilities can always be better. And yeah, there will be. The locker room can always be improved. I mean, they upgraded the locker room in the South Side this summer. And it seemed like it was pretty nice. It seemed like they just updated it a couple years ago. But they updated it again. They're always going to be doing more. I think they always want their practice facility to improve. I think they can always do more with the locker rooms and the team meeting rooms. I don't know any specifics, but would I expect there to be something for facilities in there? Yeah, absolutely I would. I think that's been an ongoing process. I think when Jeff Capel got here, there was a lot that needed to be done, and I think there were a lot of promises that were made, and I think a lot of those things have been done in terms of upgrades and updates to the facility and sort of the general team areas, and I think that'll continue. And I think anytime you have one of these contracts, there's part of it for that. So yeah, I do think there will be facility upgrades, and that's you can always be bigger and better, like they always say about the players, right? You can always get bigger, stronger, and faster. Well, it's sort of the same thing with facilities. You can always get them bigger, brighter, and fancier and more expensive. Potter County native says a couple weeks back you had a rant on baseball fields being clear of advertising as a sacred ground. A few days later, I saw a game with Moen projected on the back of the mound as advertising on TV. Does that rankle you also? By the way, I appreciate your view on keeping the advertising off the diamonds. Projecting it on TV probably wouldn't bug me as much as if there was something actually on the grass or on the field and I was at the game. Like when I'm at the game, I want to be baseball in particular. I want to be able to look down at the field and it's just pristine. A batter's box circle. Each team, batter's box circles. And you can put whatever you want there, team logo, sponsorship, whatever it is. But like once you get up, or not batter's box circle, whatever, like warm up circle, on deck circle. That's what they're called. The on deck circles. Like okay, you want to put something there, it's fine. Top of the dugouts, it's fine. But as you get closer to the batter's box, I want green grass. I want brown dirt. I want perfect white lines. I want the mound to be perfect. I want the bases to be totally cleared. I want the grass to be immaculate. That's what I want. And it really just applies to baseball. Like if you put me at a football stadium and there were logos and things on the field, I would hope there aren't too many, but okay, fine. Basketball court, I really don't care. Hockey, sure, that all fades over the course of a period anyway. But baseball, I just want that to be nice and clean and perfect. And again, it's really about my experience at the game. If I was watching on TV and they had a projection of something, I'd get a little annoyed about it, but it wouldn't have the same effect on me as if I was there and it was actually in the grass. So that's me. I mean, I still think a baseball field is something special. There's nothing like a well manicured baseball field. I mean, it's just a thing of beauty. I mean, a baseball field is a thing of beauty anyway. When you can stand at home plate and it expands out like that, it's like, I don't know. It almost feels like you're just staring out into a broad expanse. And there is a wall out there. There's a limit where it reaches, but it's so far away. It's 300 feet away. It's 400 feet away. It might as well not even be there. It's just, it's a gateway. It's just beautiful. And don't put advertisements on it. Put them on the walls. Put them on the dugout tops. Put them on the on-deck circle. In between the lines. The batter's box. The home plate. Keep it clean, man. Pit Parade says, what is it about linebacker Kyle Lewis that has the Panther-Lair writers and others around the program that's so high on his game? Yeah, we are, aren't we? Jim did his bold prediction for the linebackers this week, and it was that Kyle Lewis will be an all-conference player. We've predicted a lot of all-conference players in these bold predictions of our position preview stories, but I also named Kyle Lewis as a breakout candidate this week. When I talked about 5 players on defense that I think are going to have a breakout season, Kyle Lewis was one of them. Why is it? I think there's a lot of natural talent there. I think he's athletic and fast, but it's not just what I think from watching his high school film, which I think was really impressive, and he was really good in high school. It's also talking to people around the program. They just seem to feel like he's got good instincts, got a nose for the ball, and again, that athleticism and speed. He's a physical player. He just seems to have really taken to the position and done well with it. And even before he got hurt as a freshman, there were people in training camp saying, like, this dude's going to be a really good player and probably going to play as a freshman and be a really good linebacker for Pitt. Now, he got hurt, didn't really get much time. And so that didn't come to pass, and the injuries have sort of dogged him here and there. But if he can stay healthy, I think he's going to be good. And for the reasons I mentioned, the athleticism, the speed, good IQ, nose for the ball, just really has, I think he's got a really bright future. We are high on him, and I think the Pitt coaches are too. Pit Parade also says, why do we suppose that the 3 original basketball coaching hires by Jeff Capel are still with the program and likely headed back for a 7th season? Is that a good thing they've stayed as long? Does it have any connection or bearing to Jeff Capel's recent contract extension? Look, that's one of the weirdest things going right now in Pitt sports, honestly. And I'm glad you brought it up because we haven't talked about it in a while. But you just don't see this in any sport, college or pro, that you keep an entire staff together like this, even a small one where it was just Jeff Capel, Jason Capel, Tim O'Toole, and Milan Brown. But for all of those guys still to be here after 6 years, now maybe the cynical among us will say, well, yeah, because nobody wants to hire those guys. Fine, whatever. But they also haven't gotten fired. They haven't left to take any other jobs, to be assistants anywhere else, to get a head coach. Nothing. It is mind-boggling and defies all standard practices in the industry for these guys all to still be on the staff here. It's the weirdest thing, and I don't know what to make of it. I guess, I mean, like, Jason obviously is coaching with his brother. I think Milan feels a strong connection with Jeff Capel and Jason Capel. I think Tim O'Toole is happy here and comfortable here. But it's still so, I don't even know what the right word is, atypical to have an entire staff stay together like this. And I don't know what to make. I'm sure those guys got raises out of this latest contract extension, but I don't know what to make of it. It's weird. that's all I've got. I don't know what to make of it. You say, why do we suppose they're still here? I think they like being with Jeff Capel. I think they like Pitt and Pittsburgh, and obviously they haven't gotten fired. So here they are. Is it a good thing they've stayed so long? I think they've been a good support system for Jeff Capel. I think they've been lightning rods at times, particularly Jason Capel has been. But on the whole, I think, the last couple of years they've done a good job. So, I'd say that's more or less a good thing. For our last question, we always take these questions from the message boards. But for our last one, we're going to make an exception that we don't make very often. But we're going to do this right here. We got a mailbag comment question that came via Twitter DM. And this is the only time we're going to do this. But it comes from Panther for Life. Quote, one of the most active Pitt basketball fan accounts on Twitter. Panther for Life. At Jedi Master 868. That's who it is. Says Pitt fans tend to evaluate the program through their sole history and experience. Example, the Howland Dixon Big East teams are essentially the standard. But if you look at the job Jeff Capel has done, how does it compare to the other ACC coaches are doing? Especially traditional powerhouses like Louisville and Syracuse where resources abound. By what metrics and by what result might we grade Jeff Capel's performance on an ACC curve, especially recently? Where does he rank among his ACC peers? And that's an interesting question. I think it's tough to rank where he stands because I think you can break it down. You can chop that question up a lot of different ways. Like in the last 2 years, he's been one of the best coaches in the ACC. I think bar none. And I think most of the coaches in the ACC would tell you that for the last 2 years, he's been one of the best coaches in the conference. Top four. I would say no worse than top four, and maybe even better than that. And I think if you polled every coach in the conference, that's what they would say. That Jeff Capel's been top four, maybe top three, maybe top two coaches in the ACC over the last 2 years. But before that, because I still have my trusty yellow pad with all the data, before that, he went 3-15 in the conference, 6-14, 6-10, 6-14. He has 26 wins in the ACC, he has 47 wins in ACC play, and 26 of them have come in the last 2 years. So you can't entirely ignore the first 4 years. And so it's hard for me to rank where he stands. Like I say, based on the last 2 years alone, sure, he's top four at worst. Based on the entirety of the last 6 years, he's a bit worse. So it's hard for me to rank him on that curve of the rest of the conference. It really is. There are other guys in the conference who have had more success over the last 6 years than Jeff Capel, but there aren't many who have had more success over the last 2 years than Jeff Capel. And so Capel ranks, I think, pretty high when you boil it down just to the last 2 years. But when you talk about the last six, that curve is a little bit more challenging. I think the thing with Capel, when we want to judge him and think about the job he's done, I think you have to look at the entirety of the 6 years. Not just the results of the 6 years, which are certainly relevant, and you have to consider the fact that I forget what the number was. I mean, he's just a few games over 500 over the course of 6 seasons. Now, he's 23 games over 500 over the course of the last 2 years. But you have to look at the entirety of it. Okay, and you have to consider what his record is and what his performance has been for 6 seasons, where there have been 2 very good seasons and 4 very bad seasons. But you also have to consider the overall program and the arc of the program and what he inherited and the fact that it took him until year 5 to finally post a winning record, to win more than 20 games, and to reach the NCAA tournament. Of course, you could boil down inside that even more and talk about the pandemic. And I think there's a lot of Pitt fans who look at Jeff Capel brings up COVID a lot and how that year really interrupted their progress of rebuilding this program. And I think some Pitt fans look at it and say, like, shut up, dude. Everybody had to deal with that. You're not unique or special because you had to deal with that. And you're right. But you have to consider the fact that it was in like year 3 when that happened. And he's in the process of trying to build a program, and he can't bring any recruits to campus. And I think you have to place the pandemic in the context of that arc, of that journey that Jeff Capel was on of trying to rebuild the program. So he comes into a terribly challenging situation. He's trying to build it, running into a lot of problems, some of which are of his own making. He's not blameless in these things. And then right as he's in the process of trying to build this up, he runs into a pandemic that limits them to playing 22 games one season. They can't bring recruits on campus. It turns everything upside down. And Jeff Capel has often mentioned the value of being able to bring guys to campus and how important that is for recruiting to Pitt. And again, cynical Pitt fans may say like, yeah, well, big deal. Nobody could bring their recruits to campus. And you're right. But you have to understand where Pitt was at that time, where Pitt was when Capel was hired and where they still were by the time of the pandemic. Okay, because at that point, Pitt still hadn't reclaimed its place as something of a household name, like the way it was 10 years earlier, 15 years earlier. It lost all of that national recognition through the waning years of the Dixon era and the 2 years of Kevin Stallings. And that took a while to get back. All right, because Pitt became irrelevant on the national scale. So you needed to be able to bring guys to campus to sell them on Pitt, because Pitt wasn't a school that just resonated with guys. It wasn't a school that it meant something. It didn't mean anything to high school kids, because high school kids coming out in 2020, they were 8 years old the year of the Butler game. They were 6 years old the year of the Villanova game. When Pitt made the Elite Eight. They were in, single-digit years old when Pitt was winning the Big East. And so those things don't resonate with those kids. And you haven't had any success in the previous, 10 years to make an impression on kids as they're growing through middle school and into high school. And now you can't even bring them to campus. So you may say, Capel, shut up about the pandemic, man. Everybody had to deal with it. And they did. But the pandemic was particularly hurtful and harmful to what Capel was trying to build and the point he was in the process. It put a pause to the process, to the progress that they had made. And then they had to start over. Now, 2 years after that pandemic year, they win 24 games. They go to the NCAA tournament. He's the ACC Coach of the Year. So that's why I say, where does Capel rank among the ACC coaches? It's tough for me to put him in a spot because there's so many different ins and outs. But the last 2 years, he's been one of the top 4 coaches in the conference. And I have no reason to doubt that he can do it again this year, that he's rebuilt the roster again this year, and he'll keep it going this year. But we'll see. We'll see where it goes. But shout out to Panther for Life. Follow him on Twitter if you don't already. One of the most, as he says, one of the most active Pitt basketball fan accounts on Twitter. Lots of good insight and info. A good follow if you're on Twitter. It's Friday, right? This is like Follow Friday. Since we're talking about 2010s, kids who are in high school right now would have no idea about Follow Friday on Twitter. But Follow Friday, Panther for Life. Panther for Life. It's a good follow. All right, like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com if you don't mind. I think it would be mighty swell if you did. Don't forget to check out the website, Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Thanks so much for tuning in today. Thanks for tuning in this week. It's been a lot of fun, as it always is. I hope you have a great Friday. I hope you enjoy your weekend, and we will catch up with you again on Monday for the Morning Pit right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.